welcome everyone to this webinar on out-licensing presentations led by Carlos Velez. But just before we get started, I've just got a few bits of information I want to provide before I hand over to Carlos. So this webinar will last approximately 30 minutes in total. And that'll include about 20 minutes approximately of content, and then we'll have about 10 minutes of Q&A at the end. If you do have any questions during the webinar, please post them in the questions box and I will put them to Carlos at the end of the webinar. So before we begin, I just want to do a few go through a few introductory slides about EBD Academy. Next slide, please, Carlos. So EBD Academy was formed out of a partnership between PTI, who are based in London, and EBD Group, both companies who are part of the Informa PLC brand. And EBD Academy launched this year back in March at BioEurope Spring, and our aim is to be sort of the training arm of the EBD Group and events, providing training to the EBD community, so those that are involved in partnering, funding, licensing, etc., small biotech, large pharma as well. And you'll be seeing us running courses prior to many well-known EBD events, such as Biopharm America, BioEurope, Biotech Showcase, and BioEurope Spring. Next slide, please. And here's a breakdown of what EBD Academy will be doing. So we'll primarily be focusing on a lot of classroom face-to-face courses, but we'll also be doing a lot of online and digital products in the near future, and we can also do in-house customized training, so we can take the course, customize it and deliver it at your facility. Next slide, please. And finally, if you have any questions about the EBD Academy, please send an email to this address or visit the website on the EBD Group page. And that's it from me. I'm going to hand over to you, Carlos, and I'll be on the line muted. If you need anything, give me a shout.
Okay. Well, thank you, Alex, and good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us on this webinar on out-licensing presentations. My name is Carlos Velez. I'm the co-founder and managing partner of Lacerta Bio. If you have any questions, again, put them in the chat box or feel free to contact me directly. And my email address is there. This webinar is actually one section of a much larger masterclass, which I will be presenting on September 25th in Boston. This will be the day prior to Biopharm America. And that masterclass will be a soup to nuts class on out-licensing. And we're going to be talking about basically 4 different aspects of out-licensing. Presentations, planning for your outreach, the actual execution of your outreach when you're trying to out-license, and tracking. We're also going to touch on some other things such as data room organization and how to synchronize and organize all of these disparate activities. So if this topic is of interest and if you want to learn more, do check out the information that's available from the EBD website for this masterclass that we'll be presenting in September in Boston, where we'll be talking about, like I said, the entire soup to nuts when it comes to out-licensing. So for today, we're going to focus on the presentations, the pitch decks, if you will, that all of us should be using when we're trying to out-license. And one of the myths that we see all the time is this idea that one presentation is enough for out-licensing. And you know, when all of us try to out-license something, sometimes we go online and try to get some advice, and we see, you know, articles like this where they say, you know, you do these 10 slides or these 15 slides and you will get the money. Unfortunately, a lot of these articles are poorly written, and they're quite frankly, they're just clickbait. They're just there to try to get you to click on the Staples ad, or to try to get you to buy some underwear or makeup or what have you. The reality is that if you try to prepare just one presentation for out-licensing purposes, it's really like trying to use one multi-purpose tool to fix everything. Now, a multi-purpose tool does have its place. They are handy to carry around and they're good in an emergency situation. But when you're out licensing, you're talking to multiple different companies at different times, at different locations, under different circumstances. So you can't just carry around one tool. You just can't carry around one of these to try to accomplish what you need to do. We need to take a much more sophisticated, a much more customized approach. And so the question that we will answer in this webinar is, if one presentation is not enough, then how many are enough? How many presentations do you need, and what do they look like? And in clickbait fashion, I will tell you an answer which may surprise some of you. The answer, in our view, is three presentations plus one more little thing, which we'll talk about. So what are the three? And we're going to talk about all these in a bit more detail in a moment, but let me give you an overview of what's coming. The first one is what we call the follow-up deck. This is about 30 some odd slides. This is typically the one that we recommend that you prepare first. And I'm going to show you an outline of what that presentation should look like in a moment. That's the first one, the follow-up deck. The second one is what we call the conference deck or the meeting deck. This is a simpler version of the follow-up deck. This is what you would bring with you when you go to, let's say, a partnering conference like Biopharm America or Bio or Biotech Showcase. And in a few moments, we're going to compare and contrast the two so you see the difference. The third one is what we call the confidential deck. And as the name implies, this is essentially a presentation that has some level of confidential information. It's essentially the follow-up deck with additional confidential information that's been added to it. And the confidential deck, as we'll talk about in a moment, is important because it helps bridge the discussion that you've had so far with potential partners and the information that's in your data room. So those are the three: the follow-up deck, the conference deck, the confidential deck. Now, the plus one is the text that you will use to try to secure meetings at conferences, or the text that you will use in emails that you will use, or maybe the text that you will use in a LinkedIn invitation to try to secure a discussion or a phone call with a potential partner. So we're going to talk about all of these in a little bit more detail. Now let me start with the follow-up deck. This is going to sound a little bit odd. This is going to be the deck that you will send to a potential partner after the initial call or after the meeting. So it's about 30, 35, 40 slides. An appendix is a good idea, some section breaks in there, and like I said, I'm going to show you an outline of this in a moment. But the key thing with the follow-up deck is that it's meant to be read. It's not meant to be presented live. It's meant to be read. So it's perfectly fine to have graphics and a lot of explanatory text, because hopefully the audience will literally read what they're viewing. We recommend that this presentation be prepared first, and in a moment we'll discuss why that's the case. The meeting deck is the actual file that you're going to use when you are at let's say a 25-minute meeting at Bio or at Biopharm America. This is a presentation that's got to be very short, because as you know, when you're trying to out-license and you're sitting in a booth, you don't have a lot of time. So 10 slides max. You should be prepared to skip around in some cases or skip over some slides depending on who you're talking to and their level of knowledge. This is something that would be a bit more graphical and a lot less text, because it's meant to be presented, it's meant to be displayed, it's not meant to be read. And we generally recommend that you prepare the follow-up deck first and then prepare the meeting deck second. Now, why? Now, a lot of this is personal preference. I tend to prefer to spend the time to build a rock-solid 30 to 40 slide follow-up deck, and then take that and summarize it down to 10 slides so I can carry that deck with me, let's say, to a partnering conference. Some of you may prefer to go the other way. Some of you may prefer to start with 10 slides. That forms essentially your outline, if you will. And then you may expand it out to 30, 40, 50 slides and then whittle it back down to 30. And that whittled down presentation becomes what I'm calling your follow-up deck. And that's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with going, in one direction or the other. I just happen to find that if I work on the longer deck and wrestle with all the issues that are in that deck, and if I go through that process first, then I have a much clearer picture of the key things and the key messages that I want to convey to a potential partner while I'm sitting in that booth having that 15 minutes that I have with a potential partner. So it's personal preference, but my very strong bias is to start with the follow-up deck first from a creation point of view. And again, I'm going to show you an outline of the follow-up deck in a moment. So we've talked about the follow-up deck. We've talked about the meeting deck. The third presentation is what we call the confidential deck, which, as the name implies, it's basically the follow-up deck plus confidential data. So it's 30, let's say 30 slides in the follow-up deck. You're going to add a little bit more information there. Now, one of the things that we'll talk about in the class in Boston is, how do you decide what is confidential information versus what is not? Clearly, you need to show something after your potential partner has executed a CDA. But really what you're trying to do there is show them enough confidential information that they get so interested that they want to move forward to the next step, which would be access to the data room, or maybe even getting to an initial term sheet discussion. So because the confidential deck is essentially a derivative of the follow-up deck, it's going to look very, very similar. So lots of graphics, lots of explanation. And again, you want to have direct references in that deck to files and other things that are in the data room. So that's the bridge between the conversation so far and the data room. So it's actually a very important piece of all this. And then lastly, it's the meeting text. I received an invitation when I was at Bio a couple of months ago that was 3 paragraphs long. Okay, your meeting invitation should not be 3 paragraphs long. There should be 3 sentences long. Okay, it should be very short, very pithy, very direct, and this is important, customized to the recipient. Now, the recipient may often just be a company, because you don't know who is receiving it. But if you're sending it to an individual, it would be great if you had some sort of relationship or something else where you can try to customize that message. And again, if you go through this process of wrestling with your asset and how it's presented, you're going to come up with some key messages, some key points, some insights, some nuances, things that perhaps you haven't thought of before. Or you may come up with different language that describes your asset in a unique way. And as you come up with that language, that is the language those are the sentences, those are the phrases that you want to use in your meeting invitation. All right. Ultimately, what you're trying to do with that meeting invitation is not only do you want to convey the value and the benefit of your licensing opportunity to a potential partner, but you also want to try to sound different from all the other invitations that representative from Pfizer or Sanofi or Merck is receiving. So anything that you can do to send a meeting invitation that is insightful and creative and unique, you're hopefully more likely, or at least slightly more likely, to get that meeting accepted. And this is something that we're going to be talking about in detail during the class in Boston. I'm going to show you in Boston some messages that I have received over the years that don't work, and some suggestions for how they can be improved. So don't underestimate the importance of the meeting text. So you've created these presentations, you've written your meeting text, you've wrestled with all this stuff for a number of weeks or months. How does this all work? Once you have all this in place, the execution it should be self-evident to all of you on this webinar. You use the meeting text to get that meeting. That's the only objective, get the meeting. After that, you have your meeting deck. It's going to be very limited. As you know, many of you know the dynamics of meeting in a booth at a conference. You may only have 15 minutes, 20 minutes. You may only have time for 5 slides, 4 slides after you finish talking about the weather and everything else. So you got to keep it short, but crystal clear, direct, visual, memorable. And tell the recipient, tell your audience that the follow-up presentation that they're going to receive is going to be a more detailed version of what they just saw in the meeting booth, okay? Tell them in advance that the email that they're going to send is not going to be the same 10 slides. It's going to be a little bit more detail. And people will appreciate the fact that you're going to send them more detail than what you try to show them in a 10-minute conversation. So when you send them the follow-up deck, again, repeat, say in the email that this is a more detailed version of what you saw when we met at Biopharm America in Boston. Then at that point, it's time to execute CDA. Then you send your confidential version, and then you persist and you persist. While all this is going on, you should be hopefully organizing your data room. And as you work through the presentations, hopefully you will think about the content in your data room a little bit differently. Hopefully the presentations will help you think about how to organize your data room, what kind of summaries you have in the individual folders in your data room, little mini presentations that you may have to try to summarize the data. These are all good ideas to try to make the data room process as easy and as simple to follow for the company or the folks who have executed that CDA. So it's never a good idea just to dump stuff in a data room. It's good to have summaries and guides and so forth. And a lot of the slides that you will create, especially for the follow-up deck and for the confidential version of that deck, are really good ways to help you sort of organize and present some of the data in the data room. Now, some of you are wondering, what is this secret outline, this secret formula, this magic outline that will help you get a presentation? Unfortunately, the big secret when it comes to putting together a follow-up presentation is that there really is no secret. Well, I take that back. The secret, if you will, is showing less data but having more explanation. So I'm going to repeat that. It's actually less data but more explanation. You know, oftentimes I see a lot of these out-licensing presentations, and they're just crammed with data and 6 graphs on a slide and 2 tables on a slide, and there's just a header and these complex tables, and there's no explanation, there's no insight, there's no way for the reader to look at a complex slide and say, okay, what does this mean? Why am I looking at this? Why is this relevant to me as a scout working at Big Pharma ABC? So remember that this is a process. You're trying to lead your potential partner through a process. So if you think about this process as, you know, you're peeling an onion, you're taking it layer by layer. When you're talking about a follow-up deck, the more time you take to explain and the more time you take to put this asset in the context of the person that you're talking to, the more likely you are to move this process forward. So if you learn nothing from this webinar, it's just learn this one thing: less data, more explanation. So let me go through this outline fairly quickly. And I won't go through everything. I'll just touch on a couple of things. And again, if you go to the class in Boston, we're going to go through this in excruciating detail. First is the cover. I'm amazed at the number of presentations that get floated around without contact details on the cover slide. There's just no excuse for that. Your name, your email, your phone number should be on the cover slide. It should be on the back cover as well. No excuse. A lot of presentations have table of contents. And quite frankly, they're just not necessary, all right? In this little world that we operate in, the recipient is going to know what's coming. They know what's coming. A description of the technology, a description of the pipeline, the key asset, the commercial opportunity, the regulatory path. They know what's coming. So there's no point wasting that slide, that real estate, on a table of contents. Instead, what you want to do is present an executive summary, and I use that term very loosely. Instead of just providing a just blanket summary, what you want to do on that slide is you want to convey, you want to present those 2, 3, 4 key ideas, those key messages that you struggled to develop during the course of preparing all these presentations. In other words, those 2 or 3 points that you have in your meeting text will essentially be what's going to be in your executive summary. Okay, so don't waste time with the table of contents. All right, it's just not necessary. They know what's coming already. So use that slide for something useful. Use that slide to try to sell what you're trying to present, all right? In terms of underlying technology and pipeline, it really depends on what exactly it is that you're trying to out-license. If you have, for example, a drug discovery platform that you use to discover, let's say, 2 or 3 assets that are available for licensing, it doesn't really pay to spend a great deal of time describing the underlying technology. You can have that technology and save it for the appendix. What you want to do is get directly, as quickly as possible, to the pipeline. And more specifically, you want to, where possible, get down to the specific asset that you're trying to out-license. This is especially true if you have a pipeline where you have assets in, let's say, 3 different therapeutic areas, but you're only going to talk to this particular company about this particular asset in your pipeline. So it's perfectly fine to show your pipeline slide to show that, yes, your underlying technology is great because it can spit out drug candidates in dermatology, immuno-oncology, and cosmetology. But if you're only going to talk about immuno-oncology, then you should focus entirely on that to the extent that you can, all right? Don't be bashful about using breaks, chapter breaks, section breaks. In terms of describing the opportunity, again, keep it short. Focus on results. You don't necessarily need to focus a lot on experimental design and so forth. Try to focus more on the results and the implications and the explanation for what those results actually mean. This is a good time to summarize what you've talked about so far in this presentation. Then you're going to start talking about commercial, market segments, pricing, reimbursement, and so forth. Again, the exact details and so forth will depend on the type of asset. It will depend on the geography you're talking about. You know, a reformulation, let's say for European markets, may have a different twist compared to, let's say, an NCE for oncology markets. So it really kind of depends on what we're talking about and how much detail you get into in terms of what the commercial implication is of your asset that you're trying to out-license. Be careful with revenue forecasts. It seems like everybody has a multi-billion-dollar commercial opportunity. Don't be afraid to use comparables to make sure that your forecasts are reasonable and tied to something that's actually realistic. In terms of development plans and timing, it's always a good idea to have development plans in your presentation, especially if they have been prepared by an external CRO or somebody who's highly, highly qualified. You don't want an opportunity to fall apart simply because you're presenting a development plan that's completely unreasonable, okay? And then, you know, summarize, keep it positive, feel free to add more detail to via the appendix. What's missing? Management biographies. You don't need to go into a lot of detail on management biographies. It's at this point in the conversation, it's really not important, especially if that information is available on a website. The exception being, if you're looking, let's say, for a co-development type of relationship where you have cash and you're going to invest your cash and your expertise in a particular relationship, then yes, your expertise is in a sense an asset that you're also trying to include as part of a transaction. So under that scenario, yes, you will want to include some detail on management biographies, but otherwise it's really, really not necessary at this point in the conversation. Again, I talked about this already, a lot of details around the underlying technology. You can keep that for later. Third point, be very careful on presenting your estimate of another company's sales and marketing expense, all right? It's perfectly appropriate for you to, you know, look at sales and marketing expenses from an internal valuation point of view. But it's really, you're asking for trouble if you're meeting with Pfizer and you're telling them what you think they're going to spend to sell and market your asset once it gets on the market. So, you know, keep that out. Try to stick to revenue forecasts and try to stick to development plans. Competition, again, it really depends on the situation. If you have head-to-head comparative data, let's say head-to-head cell-based assay for your asset versus something else, that's a great thing to throw in there. But detailed competitive assessments, that's something that's perfect for an appendix, maybe one slide in the main body, tops. Again, be careful with revenue forecasts. You want to balance between being attractive and being realistic. Use comparables if you can find it, but be careful with those. And the last point is, if you're a company that's listed on a stock exchange, you might as well say so. Just come out in front and say, we're listed on stock exchange ABC. And if your company is in the favorable position of having, again, cash to co-invest in a particular relationship, you might as well come out and state what your cash position is. Just use whatever you have disclosed to the stock exchange vis-a-vis whatever your balance sheet happens to be, whatever you've disclosed already publicly. So if that's relevant for your particular situation, you might as well go on ahead and say so. The last point here is, where possible, you want to customize your presentations for the company that you're going to be talking to. And I don't have a lot of time to talk about this, but we will talk about this in the class in Boston. But if there's any opportunity for you to present your asset in the context of your audience's pipeline, then it makes sense to do so. This will obviously require a lot more planning, a lot more preparation. You may have to do this even before you send the meeting invitation, but it's always great to have that connection between what you're presenting and the other company's pipeline. It takes work, it takes a little bit of preparation, and it takes some organization, but it's certainly a good idea to try to do that where possible. So Alex, that's all I've got. If this is of interest, then please join us in Boston, where we're going to be talking about these topics and many more during our out-licensing masterclass on Monday, September 25th, just prior to Biopharm America. So thank you for listening. And Alex, if we have any questions, I'll take them.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Yes, if you have any questions, please post them in the question box on the right-hand side of the tab, which you should see on your screen. I do have some questions here, Carlos. I'll put those to you now.
Okay.
I don't understand what you mean by less data and more explanation. Isn't the point of the presentation to present a lot of data?
That's a really good question. Again, there's a difference between presenting a lot of data and asking the recipient to try to interpret all this massive data that you're throwing at them at once, as opposed to presenting them with a little bit of data, presenting them with some explanation, with some insight, and driving their curiosity and trying to drive the conversation to the next step. And that's basically the difference. You want to show enough data that gets them intrigued, but not too much data that they're just overwhelmed and they just want to not look at your presentation and look at something else. So it's a difficult question to answer, but my general opinion is that most out-licensing decks simply have too much data, too much raw data, and not enough explanation.
Brilliant, thank you. Someone's just asked actually if this deck will be available for review. I will send this deck round and a link to everyone who registered, so everyone can see can view the recording of this, and also I'll send around the slide deck as well. I do have another question, Carlos. You said data should focus on results. What does this mean? I suppose that follows on a little bit from the last question.
Yeah, so again, if you're trying to present a piece of data and what the implications are, with exceptions, there are always exceptions, but there really isn't a need during this phase of the process to spend a lot of slide real estate on the details behind the experiments. I've seen slides where if you look at the footnote, it talks about what buffer they use in a particular experiment. I mean, that's just, you just don't need to get to that level of detail. That can all be moved into the appendix, especially when you're presenting a lot of very early stage or very early preclinical discovery stage, where experimental details are important. I'm not saying they're not important, but it's a question of moving them towards the appendix or moving them, saving them in the data room, and focusing on the results and focusing on trying to move the conversation forward.
Brilliant, thank you. And I've got a question here. How do you start to select the companies potentially interested?
Oh, it's a great question. We're going to talk about that in Boston. I was actually working on those slides yesterday. That's probably a webinar in and of itself. I mean, obviously, looking at companies, looking at therapeutic areas, looking by stage of development. Typically, the best way to get that level of data, get that type of data, is to, if you have a subscription to databases, like we happen to use MedTrack, which has pipeline data. There are other databases available. That's the easiest way to do it, because then you can search by historically, who has done transactions in this particular therapeutic area, who's active in that therapeutic area. Maybe you can use like Partnering One or Partnering 360. You can put together lists by attendances at previous conferences and so forth. Lots of different ways to do it, but the most efficient way is to have access to a subscription to databases where you can try to capture that data very quickly.
Brilliant, thank you. Carlos, you have a final question I've got here, unless anyone else posts any more. How can I customize each and every presentation if I have, say, 10 plus meetings? How do I manage my time?
Right. So when we talk about customization, really what we're talking about is customizing. Really what we're talking about is adding one slide, just one more slide into, let's say, the meeting deck or even the follow-up deck. And that one slide will be somewhere in the commercial section where it says, okay, we're in phase 2 in this therapeutic area. And by the way, we noticed that you have everything in preclinical and everything on the market. And so therefore, our asset fits right into your pipeline. So it's really just talking about one slide, but I concede the point that it's something that requires work, it requires some time, it requires some preparation. It's not something you can do easily after you've scheduled all these meetings at a conference. It's something that has to be done before.
Brilliant, thanks, Carlos. Let's have another question come in. How long meeting text? Desirably long?
Yeah, I say 5 sentences tops, of which 2 or 3 are focused on the asset or the technology that you're trying to out-license. Then that first sentence is going to be, hey, Bob, it'd be good to catch up. We met last time at Bio. Last sentence would be, thank you, looking forward to catching up, sincerely, et cetera, et cetera. So 3, 4, 5, 6 sentences tops.
Brilliant. No, I think that's it, Carlos. So thank you very much for your time, and thank you everyone for attending. And like I said before, I will distribute the slide deck and a link to the recording, so you can review this again in your own time. So yes, thank you everyone, and have a good day, and hopefully see you in Boston or in at other EBD events. Thank you very much.